the story of Benjamin Fry from breakdown to recovery. Benjamin Fry has been on his own long journey to recover from childhood trauma. The search for the right therapy was especially arduous. This video shares Benjamin's story and offers insight as to how he has been able to recover successfully.
Well, as you said, I had a very privileged life in other respects. So, I would look like someone who would expect to have an easy life. I went to good schools, great university. I was bright and capable. Life should have been very easy. And yet, kind of like under the waterline, there was this bomb waiting to go off, I think. But even looking back on it before, I had a really serious nervous breakdown just before I was 40. But before that, if I look back now with hindsight, I think that my relationships with people were always quite kind of distant, I suppose, or cool, or I found it hard to connect with people in the way that maybe other people did. And maybe as a teenager, young teenager, you don't notice these things so much. But I think as I got older and went to university, I noticed that people seemed to be more kind of knitted together with each other than I felt I was. And I think that this is kind of the legacy of being unknitted, probably, from what I considered to be in my early connections in family. And you don't really notice, I went to boarding school, so you don't really need to sort of manufacture your social life in a sense at boarding school. You're constantly surrounded by dozens or hundreds of other boys, and you get on with it. And it can be quite fun, or it can be quite horrific, depending on how it goes. But it's a simulated environment in that sense. It's more like being in a member of a village, and then kind of come out into a wider world. And I think things are more complicated than that. And I don't think I ever really managed to quite successfully understand and cope with the kind of growing complexity and sophistication of human relationships and interactions. And it was almost a case of arrested development in a sense. And I think that's because I'd kind of been winging it since I was a baby. Just been dealing with whatever came up and coping, because I was quite good at coping with things. I was quite capable and practical, and I could kind of fool myself and others that everything was fine. But really, deep down, it wasn't.
I think a lot of people will be able to relate to that, especially as a man, not being able to speak your truth and speak up and say I'm vulnerable for men is such a problem, I think. And so when you had this breakdown, you were married and you had children by then. Did you feel that coming, or was that quite a sudden thing?
Well, I think I've been having minor breakdowns throughout my 20s and 30s. I started having panic attacks in my 20s. That's what introduced me to therapy. And, then I would have, I would feel better, and then things would get worse and get better. And I think, I was very susceptible to life circumstances because I was kind of probably on the edge of coping all the time. But as you get older, life gets a little bit more, your problems get bigger when you have problems, I suppose. And I think I just coped less and less well. Getting married and getting pregnant gave me a huge amount of anxiety. And then being responsible for providing for a family, just everything, like the temperature was just turned up on everything. And I think I became less and less able to simulate, I suppose, good mental health. And in practical ways, this also was disadvantageous in that it made it harder to work competently. And it's kind of like a vicious cycle. Anyone with mental health problems will tell you this. It's like if you're having a bad day at work, then you start to worry you're going to get fired. And if you do actually get fired, then you feel even worse. And then you're panicking about finding a job. And because you're panicked, you can't find a job because every time you go to a job interview, you have a panic attack. it just goes on and on. And I think I was a bit like that. And in the end, I kind of drove myself into a sort of almost like a debt pyramid, life pyramid, anxiety pyramid scheme. And then the 2008 financial crisis happened.
Mm-hmm.
And it kind of caught me in a perfect constellation of not being very helpful, because I married a Greek lady and we'd been investing in Greek property, which at the time seemed like it might be the new Spain, because they'd been deregulating debt in Greece and this was beginning to happen. But of course, there are a few places that were hit harder in the economic collapse than Greece. So we were hit pretty hard. And then we discovered that she was pregnant with our fifth child. And I think just the combination of everything just finally cratered any last resistance I had to holding on to whatever had been trying to emerge from my childhood from the very beginning. But it was very confusing because I had no idea what was going on until much later.
Mm. And normal therapy didn't work for you, so you found yourself in a clinic in Arizona, and that was really the time when you found what really helped you going forward.
Well, that's right. I was a trained psychotherapist, so I thought I knew a thing or two about a thing or two. Reasonably well connected as well. I worked in London, and I thought if I need help, I can access it. What was interesting is that, conventional psychotherapy really didn't help me at all. I was going into what felt like a very physical reaction to my circumstances and myself. Tremendous anxiety, to the point where I was kind of, shaking or trembling most of the time. I started to sleep very badly, if at all. And it felt like a very visceral experience. It wasn't like I was sort of sitting around slightly worried about stuff. And this was the disconnect. I'd talk to people, talk to professionals, and they'd say, oh, well, maybe you could think about it a different way. And it felt like, I don't think that's going to touch the sides of this. It's like, this is in here. There's like something just running me. So yes, I did a bit of therapy. I tried everything. I tried faith healing and therapy and acupuncture and anything. And eventually, I was quite afraid of going for medication. And people said, well, maybe you should take something for this. Eventually, I was just in complete despair. And I checked into a psychiatric hospital in London. And I kind of thought, well, this will take care of the problem because that's what these hospitals do. And actually, what I remember thinking is this is even worse. It's like the doctors knew even less than the therapists, it seemed to me, who themselves didn't really seem to know what was going on. And yes, of course, I could take some pills and take some meds. But the confidence with which they stated things like, oh, you'll be fine if you do enough CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, which I knew, but, I just intuitively knew that wasn't really going to fix this problem because it's almost like in a different part of me and it was so out of control. And it was a real eye-opener to see how mental health services are kind of, on the one hand, they don't really seem to know what they're doing, but on the other hand, because I guess the higher up the tree of professionals you go, the more that they have to be seen to be confident. And if you're paying thousands of pounds for treatment somewhere, I think they feel like they have to set out their stall as if they know what they're doing. And subsequent to that, I found out so much more about this world, and I think it's really frightening how it was a bit like the way that pharmaceutical companies will kind of railroad what works and what doesn't. There's been, similar things have happened in psychology and psychotherapy. And there's an awful lot of vested interests around which aren't the interest of the patient. So I ended up in this hospital feeling like I went there thinking, okay, it's going to be rough and it's going to be expensive, but it's going to solve the problem.
In Arizona?
No, this was in England.
Oh, right, okay.
I'm still in London. And within a week of being there, I got really frightened because I thought, actually, this is not helpful at all. And I thought these people would know what to do. And they seem to have even less idea and the people I came from to try and get help. And then I got really frightened because I thought, if I'm this unwell and suffering this much, and this had been going on, for, God, I can't even remember, like nearly a year at this point. I mean, it was really bad. And I thought, well, how do I get out of this? If the nuclear option doesn't take me anywhere, what do I do? So I struggled on with the medication. I didn't really get on that well with it. I came off it, and then I tried a different doctor and some different medication. And it just was this yo-yo thing, and it seemed like I was just getting weaker and weaker and weaker. So every time I tried something, it didn't work. It's almost like it made me worse because the effort of, the aggravation of going on these meds and then having bad side effects was just depleting my very minimal resources. And I think in the end, I was just in total despair. And the only thing, sadly, which gave me any comfort was the thought of suicide. Not because I wanted to die particularly, not because I didn't like my life. I had some challenges, but, I had kids and a wife and everything to live for. But because I was in so much pain and there just seemed to be no treatment, there seemed to be nobody who knew what to do to take the pain away. So I think sometimes people can fantasize about not being alive to get a bit of relief, a kind of break from just being in agony all the time.
Did your wife and children understand what was going on at the time?
I don't think so, no. The kids were young, and we've talked about it subsequently, and I think they just found it really difficult. And I think my wife, obviously found it really difficult. And the problem with mental illness is that it's not particularly obvious sometimes. Like, if you've got a gangrenous leg, you can see it.
Yeah.
If you're just an agony on the inside, it's not really obvious. And, it's tempting to say to people things like, well, why can't you just do this? And why can't you just do that? And could you not stop complaining? And, whatever it is to make the other person feel less anxious or distressed by it. But none of that really helps. I mean, I had so many well-meaning people give me opinions about what I should do. And they're all different opinions. So they can't all be right. They're like mutually exclusive opinions. And these are even doctors and therapists. So looking back on it, it's just astonishing how much ignorance there was, or rather lack of knowledge. Yet it's also confidently put to you. People have got solutions, and now I know what was really going on, and they're just obviously wrong.
And when you went to Arizona, they said that you have the worst anxiety that they had ever seen. And what was that? Was that you said about the shaking, and then what else were they seeing?
Yeah, so, rather than indulge my suicidal fantasies, I got on a plane to Arizona, and I thought it was kind of like a last roll of the dice. And it was pretty awful. It was a pretty terrible experience just trying to settle into this clinic. And I did eventually get successfully medicated by this psychiatrist, nurse practitioner. And she did say, I think she said she'd been working in private and public settings for like 30 years. And I was like the worst case of anxiety she'd had to sit in a room with. It was just awful for her, I think, let alone for me. So I definitely felt in my body, I was constantly tense in my body, constantly stressed. I slept very little. I remember when I was in that clinic, I was at a stage where I found it hard to leave the bedroom at home, let alone the house. So to cross the ocean and go to this place full of people wandering around, I mean, some of them were quite functional. They were kind of chatting and laughing. I barely spoke to anyone for the first 2 or 3 weeks. I would just literally shuffle around in a hoodie, and I'd sit at a table in the cafeteria, all these big round tables, and people would talk and chat. And I couldn't speak. I just couldn't function at all. I was just trying to get through, the next minute or hour or session, or, just get to the end of the day, hoping that, first of all, they'd keep me safe, and secondly, they could get me medicated so that I'd be all right.
And you did recover there. So what was it that you found there that helped you?
Well, what was interesting is they had fairly recently started a new aftercare unit, which was kind of down the hill from their main hospital on the same campus. And there they were pioneering treatments for what they call trauma, which were based on the work of Peter Levine, who is a somatic therapist, has this thing called somatic experiencing. They were also using a technique called EMDR, which is another, at the time, fairly recently invented method for helping people with trauma. And what happened when I was there in America, in Arizona, is that there were still people who were saying things like, you've just got an anxiety disorder, you just need drugs and CBT. But then there was another set of people who were kind of a bit more quietly coming in and saying, look, I think, there's clearly a lot of trauma here. I mean, they knew my history. They said, you've got trauma. And a lot of their work is with addictions, and they see that from the point of view of trauma. They're saying, so you've got trauma, and we've got these newfangled treatments for trauma. Why don't you try it? And so really my kind of 5 weeks in their hospital program was just getting medicated and stable. And then I went on to this more open-ended treatment program. And it's just like a completely different world. The moment I met the woman who ran the place, I knew I was safe. I knew that they could help me. And this is what I've been looking for like a whole year, was just somebody who could sit with me and say, yeah, I can see you, and this is your problem, and I've seen this before, and this is how we treat it. Come on down and we'll do it. And it seems so commonplace. It's like, you go to the doctor with, I don't know, a sore foot or something, and he says, has a look at your foot and says, I can see you've got a bruised tendon, and this is what you need to do. It's just like that. And they knew what was wrong with me. They knew that I had what they call PTSD, which I found very hard to hear, because what we think of as PTSD is like people who've been to war or in a car crash or something. And they said, no, you have PTSD from childhood, and it's all been activated and it's all come up. And there's no point doing things like CBT, because you can't even, when all these things happen to you as a child, you didn't even have language, let alone thoughts. So, it's all in your body, it's all in your nervous system.
And do you think that trauma from childhood is from your mother dying, from moving house, from having an absent father, all of those things meshed in together just builds the trauma?
Yeah, I think what happened for me is that there were probably quite a few specific, if you like, injuries in childhood. I mean, I think even going back to watching my mother die and being around, my mother was 24 when she was dying. So being around a 24-year-old woman who's probably panicking about, is she going to die or not, while trying to raise an infant. All of it. But, there were kind of layers. It's like pancakes, stack of pancakes. And I think what happened for me is it's like the whole thing just collapsed in one go. So all of these different injuries were just like a domino effect. Just
snowballing.
Yeah, setting each other off. And what we did in treatment is we did quite a lot of EMDR, which began to tease out these individual experiences and memories. Amazingly enough, while doing EMDR, the memories of things that you wouldn't normally be able to remember kind of re-emerged. And they kind of come out of what's called the limbic system, the mammal brain, the reptile brain, the part of the brain that responds to threat. Was obviously busy responding to threat even when I was very young.
Yeah.
And so the treatment is kind of allowing that place to recover.